So, yeah, okay.
Well, you'll just be Simon for today. It's okay.
Okay. Oh, right. Okay.
I
Yes.
Right. Enjoy, everyone. I'm muting.
Fantastic. So we've got people coming in. Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Hello there. Come on in. Just wait a couple of minutes for everyone to get here, as usual.
That's fine.
Hi, everybody. I think most of us are in. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So we'll get started. Welcome to tonight's Embercombe online talk. We're on the subject of rewilding tonight, and we have with us Derek Gow, who is known as a guerrilla rewilder in some circles. He lives just up the road from us on a farm where he breeds and brings in and releases Britain's lost wild species. I'm sure he will tell you more about that himself. He has been told that he commits the most subversive nature conservation acts of our modern era. He says he's doing it for the salvation of wild creatures. He is no stranger to Embercombe. He's helping us with our rewilding projects there, and he teaches on our programs and will do so next year. So we're absolutely delighted to have him talking with us tonight. He has got a recent book out on beavers, bringing back the beaver, one man's quest to rewild Britain's waterways. So we'll be talking specifically about beavers tonight. And I would love to know, Derek, welcome. I would love to know specifically why the beaver. What was it about the beaver? What is it about the beaver that you are so committed to?
Well, thank you very much indeed for asking me to speak tonight, Rachel. Why beavers? Well, quite simply, beavers are the deliverers of life. A time when we're looking at a planet that comprises, 95%, or its vertebrate fauna comprises 95% of us and our domestic animals. And when nature is hurtling, it's no longer falling off the edge of the cliff, it's in free fall. The beaver is an animal that if you restore it to riparian wetlands and in the kind of landscapes we all know, from our own experience, it gives nature the ability to heal itself. 80% greater biodiversity where beavers exist, so very many more frogs, very many more insects, very many more fish. And with this, you get a much greater biodiversity of the higher species as well. So if you want to take an animal and put that animal back into an environment and use that animal as an essential life force to start healing that environment and making things better for both the smaller and greater creatures that also occupy it, then the beaver is the animal for you. So there is no great problem about answering why beavers. It's because they are, they're a life force. It's quite simply that.
Where did it start with beavers then? When was your first beaver experience?
Well, I'm quite sure, like everybody, when I was little, I saw beavers at the zoo, and I can't remember them being anything other than dull. I mean, they were one of the most boring animals to look at. Generally, you'd look into a pen at Edinburgh Zoo, and there wouldn't be a beaver in sight. And if there was a beaver in sight, it just looked like a dead hat sleeping on the floor. And of course, you'd lots more exciting animals alongside. And you paid very little attention to beavers, though my mum assures me that there were beavers then when she had to trail me to the zoo. But I guess, I mean, really for me, the beaver thing began in the early 1990s. I'd been working with water voles for perhaps 5 or 6 years before that. And it became apparent, I think, to all of us who were working with this little animal, which, Kenneth Graham based his character of Ratty in Wind in the Willows on, and which, everybody was terribly concerned in the early 1990s with saving. was that the habitat where water voles lived and which they preferred, which is open, sunny wetlands, full of plants, full of iris, full of sedges, you know, full of a myriad of pools singing with dragonflies and crickets and open to the sun, was not a habitat that existed naturally. If we didn't cut the trees down, if we didn't create pools, if we just didn't make their living space, they could not make their own. And as soon as you started to think that way, you began to realize that there must have been something there, you know, in the environment before the trees overshadowed the rivers that took them down and generated ponds and pools and made living space for this little creature that enabled it to survive. And of course, as soon as you start to think along those lines, and then perhaps you start to go to Europe and you listen to the initial people who talked about restoring beavers in the early 1990s, you realize, of course, it's the beaver. So I was interested because of water voles. At the time, I was managing, I think I was managing a wildlife centre in the New Forest, and I went to speak to some of the guys that had been asked about importing beavers and whether it would be possible, because of course in the early 1990s, there weren't even Eurasian beavers, which is the species that was formerly found in Britain, present in zoos. And he told me it was terribly difficult and terribly expensive, and you needed all these water facilities and to purify the water flowing out of the quarantine tanks, da-da-di-da-di-da. And they'd had a look at it in tremendous depth, and they were pretty sure it couldn't be done. And at that point in time, you thought, you know, actually, that's a lot of shit. I'm pretty sure it can be done. So I spoke to some of the guys in continental Europe and actually to some of the circus people who were an unsavory bunch, but if you wanted to know something about animals and how you handled moved animals, you ask them, and there wasn't an awful lot they didn't know. And we decided we have a try, and in the mid-1990s we went to one of the state farms in Poland, which were built in the time of Stalin to resupply beavers for the fur trade. They agreed to give us some beavers, and we imported the first bunch of beavers back into Britain, and they all came through quarantine with no great problem at all. And we had our first breeding animals, you know, at that point in time from Poland.
At what point were they released then, Derek? I mean, I don't want you to ask you how many have been released and how many you've been responsible for, but at what point did they move from those kind of conditions out into the wild?
Well, the first official release in Britain was actually in England in the early 2000s at a place called Ham Fen in Kent. It was a very large area of former fenland, you know, ironically, you know, near to the town of Sandwich. So you had the kind of analogy between Ham and Sandwich. And we had a look at the legislation pertinent to beavers at the time. Kent Wildlife Trust wanted to grow the size of the old fen, which was 9 acres and 120, with the rest of the landscape around the 9, all of which they by then owned, having been improved for farming over the course of the last 50 years. And as a result, the old fenland vegetation and some of the unique fenland plants were just fading and dying. They couldn't keep up with chopping down the willow in the middle of the old fen, and they decided that what they wanted to do was put a fence around it and put beavers in there to see if the beavers as a management tool could do a better job than they were doing. So we got some beavers from Norway. There was a fairly significant fight with DEFRA over whether we could put them in there, but ultimately we were allowed to do so. And those were the first ones that lived free and bred in England since perhaps the late 1800s, or certainly the late 1700s, sorry, early 1800s. In Scotland, the first official release was in 2009, when the incoming SNP administration decided that they had to be bold with regard to this creature and actually do something as opposed to talking, which is what happened for the 15 years before then. And they granted the Scottish Wildlife Trust and the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland a licence to reintroduce the beaver into Knapdale Forest in Kintyre. But before that, it's now obvious that there were other populations of beavers also living free in Britain, in at least a couple of locations in Scotland, principally on the Tay, but elsewhere as well, and perhaps also, you know, after 2000 in different parts of England, but nobody knows where they came from.
Okay, and how many populations do we have now? Does anybody know, or are they out there?
Well, what's known is that there are beavers on the Bristol Avon, there are beavers on the Tamar, there are beavers on the River Stour in Kent, and there are beavers on the River Otter, there are beavers on the Tay, there are possibly some beavers maybe on the River Dovey in Wales, some beavers on the Severn. There are beavers in Knapdale still, though they're being reinforced at the moment, and there may be other beavers elsewhere as well.
I'm really inspired by your commitment to bringing beavers and other species back. I mean, what is it that drives it, Derek? What are you hoping to achieve?
We all live short lives. Many things that we encounter in our lives divert us from the reality of that. I mean, when I was little, I lived in a landscape which was still relatively wildlife rich, though had I known it, it was fading then fast as well. I went to school on the Scottish borders in a little town called Broughton, which is approximately 4 miles away from where I lived, in a place called Biggar, and I had to travel backwards and forwards from school on a green double-decker bus. And when you did that in the early 1970s, you were still traveling through a landscape which was full of lapwings, full of curlews. I remember quite clearly one day seeing blackcock lecking on a farm called Broughton Now. And that's all entirely gone. There were inland breeding colonies of black-headed gulls in their thousands in wet soaks and valley bottoms. And not only have the birds I've just talked about gone, the living environments those things occupied now have also near completely gone. The intensification of agriculture since the Second World War has destroyed wetlands, or destroyed what's left of the wetlands, because of course we started this process in the Bronze Age on a staggering scale and rate. The edge habitats are now all but gone. In Devon, the little pastures of Bronze Age habitat that have been here with their calm grasslands and insectivorous plants and flowers and insects they're not even fragments in the landscape. They're tattered slivers. And in the time I've been down here since 2003, I mean, I've seen those things contract again as well. So when it comes to why did I do it? Why do I do this? I do it because I want to, because at the end of the day, I think it's right that somebody should make an effort on behalf of nature. And I'm not alone in that. There are very many people who feel that way. It just so happens that through a combination of circumstance and luck, I've been able to do things I never believed I would ever have the opportunity to do in my life. And I think we should do these things urgently. We know that life's fading fast. And I was talking to a friend of mine today who was telling me that, they're going to reintroduce a fish called the burbot over in the east of England. It's this fish that's, I think its old English name was the eel pout. It's this great big marbled cod with feelers in its lower jaws and just beneath its eyes and its upper jaws. And we're still a year and a half away, from, following a series of, studies to look at the eDNA of the waters and the fenlands to see if there are any fish left. And then there's going to be another period of contemplation, and then maybe they'll get licenses issued, and then there'll be 5 or 6 years of mistakes. And you look at it in this and think, does anybody actually realize we're at a critical point in time here? That this massive cataclysm of loss is moving so fast that we can barely comprehend the speed at which it's going, and yet you were arsing around discussing a fish for 5 years. So I'm sorry, I have no time for that anymore. I have to attend meetings occasionally. I don't really want to do so. Now I'm 55. I've spent long enough sitting listening to fools waffle, and I don't want to do it anymore. So as far as I'm concerned, it's quite clear. I mean, I want to move on with the restoration of a number of different species, and I want to start a debate about the restoration of others that we should have started talking about sanely a long time ago. And I cannot answer you any more adequately than that. That's why I do it. That's my life.
What do you, and thank God that you do, Derek, and yeah, I think what you do is fantastic, as do many other people in the country at the moment.
It's very little.
What do you think
Very,
needs?
very little.
Yeah, what do you think needs to happen? What can we do? What needs to happen here?
What can people do? Well, if people own land, even if it's a garden, they can start to think about what they're going to do with their own land holding. And the first thing you can do is, stop cutting the grass. Just stop cutting the grass, start to bring wood piles in, make wood piles that the birds can nest in, that they can shit in to allow the bramble and the berries that are in their guano to come back up as thorn or trees. You can put more and more pools into your garden. You can look at your garden again and make it wild. If you own a farm, you've got to stop looking at things through a farming paradigm. It's not enough just to be organic. It's not enough just to keep rare breeds. You have to stop farming in some areas, and you have to start turning those areas back into environments that are good for nature. Nature needs more corridors, more edge habitats, things like tree planting to thicken hedges and woodlands where the woodlands were blown out with dynamite in the 1970s and the last of the intensification. All these things are good. If you're a farmer, you can start to put in pool systems and think very hard about what you're there for. We all know it's an uneconomic game on areas of 120 acres or 200 acres or 250. Can you produce another income stream, or can you use the wage you have, again, just to say, enough. We don't need to graze this right down to the soil. We can use green hay to reseed wildflower meadows. And then, there are other things we'll have to do that are not just physical. I mean, the way we view animals in this landscape, especially in rural landscapes, is still, it's pretty medieval. You go down through Lifton on a Boxing Day morning, the day after Christmas, and you see the number of people that turn out for the hunt, and you have a near complete turnout of the people who own the landscape. If you look at your boards of the national parks, they're pretty much full of these people. Nice people, some, but with a view of the land and how the land should be used in a way that's I would imagine completely at odds with most of the people sitting here listening to tonight. But the people sitting here listening tonight are the people who pay their taxes for the subsidies that enable these people to function at all. So the way we need to start changing is we also in our minds need to start looking at, I have to say it, things like foxes, and just, if there was I have chickens here. Chickens are, they're just stupid pheasants. It's as simple as that. And the foxes have gone through my chickens, and even though I'm quite fond of them and they're wee characters, and I like seeing them in the morning, and they like pecking my toes when I go around giving them the corn and my flip-flops. At the end of it all, I'm not about to launch a scorched earth policy every time a chicken goes. I've long ago given up on the idea we're going to launch a scorched earth policy every time a lamb goes. And really, we just need to start showing a lot more tolerance and building better bloody chicken runs if we don't want them to be eaten by foxes. And we need to think again about hunting. I mean, I was speaking to a friend of mine from India the other day, and he was just saying, well, we were having a chat about Dalmatian pelicans, because that's another species that we'd like to have a look at the restoration of in the East. They were here, right up until Roman times. We destroyed the wetlands and we ate and killed the birds. And we had a quick chat about pelicans, and he's Indian. He comes from a place called Nagarcoil, which is right at the tip of southern India. And he said, Derek, he said, we have a lot of pelicans now. And I said, well, is there no conflict with fishermen there, Mahesh? And he said, no. He said Indira Gandhi banned hunting in the early 1970s, and in the early 1970s in India, there were still plenty of people who wanted to shoot tigers for rugs and catch lots of animals to send them back to zoos or experimental laboratories. And she just stopped it. And he said, it's taken 50 years, but now very few people want to hunt at all. And it's just stopped. And he said, you're directly seeing a response in some things that were fragile to that. So I think we really do need to start looking at what this landscape's all about. And we really need to start making a big bloody fuss about 50 million pheasants being released, and and the grouse moors with their shattered raptor communities, and the fox hunting, and you know, and the badger cull, which is a medieval thing in both action and spirit. It's exactly what happened to the wolves. It's exactly what's happened to every species that's opposed our interests in any way. So I think there's a lot we should do, and in part that's the physical work of doing things, but in part it's also down to potentially campaigning harder and understanding better the inequity of some of these things that other people think are perfectly reasonable, and you know, we now know are not. So I think there's actually quite a lot people can do.
Fantastic. And just talking about people, you know, if you have questions, we will take questions at the end, but if you have any questions as we're going through, do put them in the chat and we'll try and collect them and answer some as we're going along. So yeah, do get involved. Which species are you working with at the moment, Derek? What do you think is the most important? We've touched on beaver, but what else are you working with?
Well, the beaver stuff goes on. We're moving beavers down from Scotland at the moment to sites in England, into enclosures, and potentially perhaps on to small river trials in the not too dim and distant future. Though at the end of the day, I don't see why on earth we're still running trials. We know exactly what the animal does. They've been reintroduced everywhere else. You know, we should just be letting them go, and that's it, and not fannying around any longer. The other species we're working with at the moment are white storks. We just had another 12 birds come in from Poland, and that gives us a breeding flock of about 30, which started to produce young really rather well this year. So the idea is that you know, really from next year on, I'm hoping to be able, like Newcastle, to start releasing white storks out onto my farm to hopefully breed in the tops of the farm buildings and to forage in the fields that are regenerating with wildflowers and crickets and insects around the main farm itself. We are also looking now at setting a timescale for wildcat reintroduction, because if we don't set a timescale for wildcat reintroduction in England, you know, we'll all be sitting here another 10 years on in our bath chairs and bugger all being achieved. So we're hoping that we're going to be able to form a coalition of willing partners with a view to start releasing wildcats in England, you know, starting in 2022. We've reached the end of the diving board on this one. We know what needs to be done. We know from continental European experience that they will not just automatically hybridize themselves out of existence, that if you release sufficient cats out into the wider environment, especially in England, where you have the best habitat there is in Britain for them in the deciduous woodlands that there are full of mice, then we think this small predator will re-establish rather well. So that's probably the next big push priority. But the other project I'm working on at the moment for Chelsea Green is following the beaver book. I'm going to finish by March next year as complete a history of the wolf in Britain as has been assembled to date. And that's with a view to really trying to understand just exactly what happened to this animal, looking at actually some of the older languages which have really not been commonly used, would you believe, by the English. So to look at what the Gaels said and the Irish and the Welsh and the Bretons as well, to as I say, produce as a sound a picture of the wolf's extinction as can now be assembled.
Do you think, and somebody's just mentioned it here, Sam Cosby, this idea of storytelling and bringing back kind of some of the myths and stories of these animals can kind of help bring them up into public kind of understanding and help with campaigning? Is that, I mean, I guess that's part of what you're doing, really. Yeah,
it's a storytelling exercise, and I think it's very important. I mean, you know, if you look at what happened to the beavers, it's all very sad. In the end, you know, they were never an issue for us. The only issue was they were worth so much. They were so valuable that, you know, again, every time we talk about sustainability, and I was talking to somebody the other day about sustainable management of sea fisheries, and what he's saying is, you know, it is, even at this point in time, it would be possible to stand back from the brink and say, we can create a sustainable sea fishery, but it's going to mean that you can't catch very many, and you can't catch very many going forward, and that's just going to be it. You're going to have refugee areas where you're not ploughing the seabed and you're not destroying everything, and the fish have time to breed and recover. So we could do it that way, or we could just take everything now. Just take everything now and then it's all gone. And the problem with people is that really, when you start to look at the history of our commercial exploitation of wildlife, our commercial exploitation of things like whales and seals and penguins, which all happened not that long ago with big British companies like Christian Salvesen playing a huge part in the genocidal extermination of these species. It stopped because either there was a cheaper commercial product like petroleum that meant you didn't have to have the whale oil in the quantities that you were seeking before, or because the resource was so played out, the resource could no longer be commercially mined. So our history of our interaction with this planet has always been one that even though, whereby, even though you have reasonable people who say stop and who say slow and who may try to put the brakes on for a time in history, in the end, we always take everything. But to come back to the wolf thing again, what's really interesting about that is that by the time you start to look at the old books and you start to look at the 17th century, both in England and in Scotland, I'm not so sure about Wales because unfortunately I don't speak Welsh. We're having some work translated at the moment, which I'm sure will mirror what happened in England and Scotland. And if you look at what the old writers are saying, the old writers are saying in the 1700s that there are more stories, but they're all fading fast. So the stories with regard to these animals are the last. It's the last time I think you're even going to be able to record what people think. And to give you an example of that, I was up in Cheshire the other day, and I went with a friend to look at a wolf stone, which is supposed to commemorate the last wolf that was killed in Shropshire at a place called Wolves Acre Hall. And as soon as you go and stand next to it, you get these people, the owners of the hall, come along with you. And we look at this stone, which is a fairly big stone. And he says, well, one story is, of course, that this is where it was killed. The other story is that it's underneath it because these animals came from Satan. And they put this thing on top of it to make bloody sure it didn't get out again. And of course, that is not written down. And what you find is that when you go and speak to people, and they're old people, and they were not of a generation, or many generations, that ever knew these creatures, there's always another wee story that's there, but they're dying. They're going to become dust very soon. And unless there's some sort of record made of them now, then this animal just passes and yeah, it literally becomes dust, and that's the end.
So you're writing about wolves. Are you going to start working with wolves?
I have worked with wolves in the past. I hand-reared two a number of years ago and had them in my house, which was quite an interesting experience when they're small, because they're lovely animals, massively friendly things, but huge and very heavy. And the idea of for the biggest one of a fun night out was running upstairs when you took it in the evening, and then waiting on the mid-stairs landing. So when you were least expecting it, and you were carrying your tea into the front room, it would just land on your head. And even then, when she was a relatively little wolf, she was the kind of a size of an Alsatian. So even though she enjoyed it very much, it was a slightly disconcerting experience. I have no intention of keeping wolves again in captivity. I have no interest in that. And frankly, I mean, again, I'm 55 now. If I kept another wolf, it's probably going to nearly outlive me. So the long that you have to be realistic about this, because they become very, very fond of you, and you become very, very fond of them. And therefore, you have to have time to put these animals, and I don't have time to do it anymore either. But the long and the short of it is, I think we should start to look at just exactly what the case is, how they're living in Europe, because of course now they're returning to countries like the Netherlands and Belgium, to the outskirts of towns and cities. And what has changed with that animal, which is quite interesting, is that even though you have the worst of humanity who are still prepared to do things to them which are barbaric beyond belief, you actually have a much, much larger chunk of society who are looking at them now and saying, actually, this is just wrong. They have another role. They're important. They are literally forest guardians. If you look at some of the American writing about them from people like Aldo Leopold, he will tell you that it's not the mountain's not afraid of the wolves or the bears or the pumas that he was killing in his early life. The mountain's afraid of the ungulates, and that without the carnivores, the ungulates unchecked will reduce these environments to their skeletons. If we're going to plant another 3 billion trees in this country and take our forest cover up to 25% or whatever the government's promised from 11, to ensure that we have, we can capture, we can slow the flow of water, we can capture carbon, we can offer our grandchildren and their children, if indeed we go on as long as that as a species, the opportunity to breathe clean air, then we need to think what we're going to do about the deer, because the deer are rising year on year, unchecked, 74,000 car accidents a year with them. We need to start thinking about bringing back the wolf. The only reason why we can't do it is sheep and sheep farming, and the fear that still lurks inside our head. And if we were joined to the rest of Europe, they'd be here by now. So at the end of it all, I think it's a case that has to be considered sensibly. I think, like the beaver, when I started with this species, there were a guild of men who nearly did it and napped at Grisdale Forest in the Lake District, and they failed by not much. And it was just not the right time for them. And I think what has to happen with the whole wolf thing is there has to be a sentient conversation, and from that talking, you have a beginning. But the beginning has to be founded in understanding, and the understanding has to come from knowledge of what we did and what is happening, and then we think about it again.
Do you think things are likely to change? There's a good question from Barry here. Do you feel that there's a kind of growing acceptance from landowners that introductions are going to will have to increase?
Yes, I think things are changing very fast, actually, and I think that's incredibly heartening. I mean, this year I've been very lucky to go and see and to work on some of the projects and on some of the big estates that have been here since the time of the Normans, and without a shadow of a doubt, there's a wind of change blowing through their thinking that's just startling. They have some amazing people running them. They have some amazing people in their employ, and those amazing people understand full well that yes, whereas farming is part of the future, it's only part. It's not the dominant thing that everybody once believed it had to be, and that there's an awful lot of land that they hold within their curtilage that never was any good to farm, and that would be much better employed in creating space for nature. And they are imaginative people, they are determined, they're well connected, they are free thinking, and they own huge areas of land. And I have to say that in them, I think there is a great inspirational hope for leadership once they begin to understand what they can do. I think also there's change in the minds of people. I mean, you look at David Attenborough's films and you look at the talking there is now about this. And I also have to say that though the government is not of any political colour that I would wish to assume, that from what I've had to do with some of the Conservative politicians who are in power at the moment, the clever ones, who have an interest, they understand. I mean, people like Michael Gove, they understand the environmental issues very, very clearly, and on some of them at least have acted very well. So I think they get it. Some of them get it. They get the urgency and they get the need for change. I think some of the larger landowners also do. I'm sure there is a body of people who are going to go down with whatever ship they feel they must sail into oblivion. But there are an awful lot of other people thinking about change. And just recently, actually, just before the COVID thing started, I did a conference for the National Farmers Union in Exeter, and I asked my friend who asked me to speak at it whether he wanted something that they would find acceptable as a presentation, or whether they wanted the truth, according to me, of course. And he said, just you sock it to them. And I did. And these were not the converted. I mean, they're hill farmers from Dartmoor. You're not looking at a lot of liberal thinkers. And they were having these silly questions where you have to press silly buttons on some wee silly thing that's on your lap. And they asked them about, well, if you're going to be paid to use your land for wildlife, how do you feel about it? 63% of them said yes. I know 73% said yes. And then they said, beavers, yes or no. 63% said yes. It's changing. The old guard are going to die. They're going to go down guns blazing, and good luck to them. It's time to make progress with every funeral. But at the end of it all, I think things are changing, and I think there's great optimism there.
Do you think they will change in time, if whatever in time means?
Well, if you travel much at all, or if you did before COVID began, it's kind of hard to think of anywhere I've been where things don't look pretty played out. I mean, one of the most sobering was Morocco, and I mean, it was just myself and Gerhard, who works with beavers in Bavaria, and we're about the same age, and we got on well together. And every normal year, we just decide we're going to go somewhere, you know, for a bit of a rest at the back of Christmas, because normally it's quite a busy life. And we've been to Morocco and done kind of like boat trips down the Nile on an Agatha Christie boat without the murders. And in Morocco, you go there and you drive through the Atlas and you look at a cedar forest that was once vast, that went from the rim of the Mediterranean and the Atlantic right the way through into Libya and into Egypt and beyond. And it's shattered. And they're talking about, you know, maybe 8 leopards left. They've just discovered that the animals there that they thought were jackals are actually wolves, only wolves in Africa. And they're maybe down to the last 8 or 10. And there were all sorts of sobering reminders of that as you went through the markets and bazaars. And I think one of the most entertaining things I remember is they take you on one of these tours to this huge tannery, which has been somewhere in one of the capitals, so one of the big cities since before the time of Christ. And I asked the wee guy what had changed in that time, because when you look down at it and they're loading all these skins onto donkeys and all the vats are made of mud, and it all looks, you know, pretty elemental stuff. There's not a lot of high technology there. And he said, well, the thing that's changed is the wild animals. There just aren't any wild animals anymore. So I don't know if we are going to be in time. How could any of us tell that? I think we have to do everything we can now. I think we cannot stick our heads in the sand, not for another second. I do not think we should be farting around with stupid bureaucratic delays for licenses or anything else like that, where the case is made and the science is sound. I think we should do what the farmers do as nature conservationists, and that is get to the point where you understand the subject well, and then do it bloody fast and do it everywhere. And be determined in that. There's an awful lot of inertia, and a lot of that inertia is bureaucracy. It's people who sit in the middle who worry about their pensions and making sure that no boat ever rocks. And I think it's actually really tragic to reflect that if this world goes down, it won't be the people who are truly bad that will have caused that. You know, the people that are just wicked beyond belief, doing things that are truly despicable. It'll be this huge bloated, you know, inert mass in the middle that just made it so bloody hard to do anything much.
What could we do? You said we need to campaign, we need to wild our gardens. What could we do to help you? You know, okay, what can I do to help you, Derek? You know, what would you have us do?
Well, it's very interesting you say that. Do you know John Ray? Of course you know John Ray from Chelsea Green. So John came round yesterday, and, you know, we had a chat about just this. About a year ago, I formed a charity called Keep It Wild, because there was a tiny, tiny meadow, about 2.5 acres on the outskirts of Bude, which is almost certainly Bronze Age wet fen meadow. It's this, when my daughter was little, we used to travel up and down from Bude every Sunday to go swimming in the swimming pool and hit each other over the head with rubber crocodiles. And you through the summer, you'd pass this wee meadow, and And when you got to late summer and the iris bloomed, the whole thing was golden. And the rest of the landscape there is there's none of it left. It's all gone. It's 2.5 acres. And it came up for sale, and there's a big sign there saying that it's going to benefit from agricultural improvement. And I was so angry that the auctioneers put this up, because agricultural improvement it's a big man on a digger with a roll of plastic pipe and a flail and a tractor, and something that's been there for 10,000 years goes in 2 days, and everything that lives there, all this intricate web of tiny spiders and nesting places for sedge warblers, the whole thing is gone because of some moron in a digger, and I was hopping mad. And anyway, another friend said, well, we'll just do a crowdfunding thing, and you look at it and think, really? They want 24 grand for it, which is ridiculous. And we did, and we got the money in 2 weeks, so we own it now. And you know, we're having to think about just expanding that, about saying, look, the time is now, because my difficulty is, guys, and I'll be honest with you, is that when I do anything, it takes time to assemble, and I am not whining about it, because some remarkable people have helped me to build things like the breeding facility we now have for the cats, which is based on what the Swiss did at a place called Buchengut near Zurich, where they decided to breed them for reach. We have to negotiate for money all the time. You're always trying to form partnerships with people that are just, you know, not quite in your camp, and then you've got to negotiate and you've got to trade, and it takes time, and I'm bloody sick of it. I really am. You know, we're just talking about enough to get a few camera traps, to get 2 students up to the forest in North Devon this year to go and see if there are any feral cats living in those forests. There are things we need to do for some of these projects that are little bits of work, but they're bits of jigsaw that you need to put in place to see you've actually got a picture of a Dutch windmill and 8 tulips there. Do something. So I had a chat with John, and we're going to have a look at this again, because of interest in the book, which I'm terribly grateful for. It's been a very interesting thing to have done. There's going to be some film work done, and what I aim to do is take whatever support there is that comes from that, see if we can build it into this small foundation. And if we can, we are not going to be employing chief executives. We are not going to be paying for Axminster carpets. We are not going to be spending on anything else other than doing things that should be done as quickly as we possibly can. So that may be something that comes along, and we're not going to linger long when it comes to decisions about what we're going to do with that.
So you're calling that Keep It Wild, did I hear you say?
Keep it wild, yeah. And it's going to be doing things like figuring out how we capture breed glowworms, little inspirational things, because this tiny insect that used to be everywhere, that lit up July nights on warm nights when people were out wandering or coming back from the pub, the kids used to have in a jam jar next to their bed to light their darkened rooms. It's just fallen away as well. The hedgerow mowing and flailing, the cutting of the verges, it just finishes them, because they go down into this vegetation in the winter. The larvae go down into the vegetation in the winter, and if you flail it, then some come out one year, some come out the next year. By the time you get to year 2 and flail it, that's it. It's game over. And again, it's just enough. You know, it's really just enough. It's time now to look at these things and say, no more. I don't know whether we're going to pull this off. I mean, we have done some planet. I really would like to say what the end outcome would be, but what I can tell you is there's a lot of remarkable people out there who are trying to do things, you know, with resources that are not great, but which are incredibly important, and which might make a difference. And that's exactly the sort of thing we should be trying to do here as well.
Fantastic. Keep it wild. We'll look out for it. I just want to ask one last thing, Derek, before we open it up to more questions. I've seen a few come in, and I'm sorry, I've been so focused on what you're saying that I haven't been able to read them. But okay, so how would you like it to look? You know, say we kept it wild, you know, 10, 20, 30 years down the line, how would it look in your dream?
The landscape. The landscape with grazing livestock in fields that are square. We'd have put circular fences in the middle, and we'd let the scrub come back in from the hedgerows. There'd be whitethroats singing everywhere. There would be cuckoos there again because there'd be space for the meadow pipits. You would have blackcaps singing as well through the summer months. There'd be, we'd have created a guild of farmers and landowners that are used to untidy habitats and value them more than neatness. So any trees that fall, you pull them over and you leave them to rot where they live, and then your wood warblers return. We would have, very many more beavers. We'd have launched an ambitious process of reintroduction, putting the animals out onto the big river systems in big numbers. There's 1,500 a year being shot in Bavaria. If we turned around and said, guys, we want them, none of them would have to die. It might take us 10 years or 15 years, but we could restore this nature's healer to our river systems right the way through Britain. Fascinating why we should not do so. It would save a lot of life and do a lot of good. We'd then be looking at wildcats living there. In the wider landscape, we'd be looking at legislation to stop some of the things that are ruinous. I have no problem about shooting. Don't get me wrong, I'm not a vegetarian. At the end of it all, if you're managing land for wild bird shoot and you're putting the effort into beetle banks and scrub and all the habitats that those game birds need to rear their chicks and to prosper, and you want to shoot some of them, then that's fine. But the effort you have to put into creating the breeding stock and the habitat that's going to sustain that breeding stock can also sustain nature too. I am utterly opposed to the idea that you're going to bring in 50 million of them from Europe with these poor wee partridges reared in cages that come in pairs and go to Exmoor, and 3 weeks later their wee mates run over on the road and its partners just standing there bewildered waiting for the next automobile to come along and hit it. I frankly think it's disgusting, and it's high time that was brought to an end. It's a shameful business. Quite wrong. So I think that some things would change on the back of legislation. I think some things would change on the back of payments, but a lot of it's got to be changed when it comes to people's mindsets too. So that's the kind of landscape I would like to think we'd be heading for in about 10 years' time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Derek. I'm going to open it up to more questions now. Nusha, you may need to help me here if anyone's waving because I can't see that on my screen. But if anybody has a question, do you want to wave at me? Slow process of doing it.
There was an Emma who had her hand up earlier, but
yes, I saw that. Emma, do you want to ask your question if it's still relevant?
No, I was just having a technical moment. So no, I think things are being answered as I'm thinking them up. Thank you.
No worries. I'm also having a technical moment.
Well, there was an earlier question for Derek to explain what did he mean by Keystone species, and maybe he can unpack that, and then we can have a look at other questions.
Keystone species. So I mean, there are a lot of people who use the term keystone species is for an animal or an organism that is pivotal to the survival of an environment and all the other species that exist in that environment. People use the term way too easily. They'll tell you that crayfish is a keystone species, and it's not a keystone species. It's a food species. It's a species that, yes, needs to be there in significant numbers, but it needs the architect of the living space there to create the home it needs. So beavers are not a keystone species. Beavers, if you speak to the North Americans, are way more important than that. They are a force of nature. They're an animal, they're the creators of nature's sponges. They're the flowers of nature's rainfall. They are the staunchers of nature's drought. They have a purpose that transcends pretty much anything that any other species is capable of. And I can't remember where the quote came from, but next to us and elephants, it's reckoned that beavers are the third most impactful species on the planet. So they are not a keystone species. They're a force of nature.
there's a brilliant question here from Isabel. How can we make Derek Prime Minister? Which I think is a brilliant question.
I have no interest in politics other than
yeah, I can imagine.
being a
Sam.
very poor Prime Minister because my power of concentration is shite.
Here's a more practical question, perhaps from Sam again. How do we find out more? Where are the best places to go to find out more about what's happening and what people can do?
You know, I don't think there are very many good places you can go to find out what's happening. Oh gosh, let me think of inspiration. I mean, Embercombe was quite inspirational. I mean, some of the kind of open talking sessions we had last year, because as speakers, you're always used to the idea and give your view of something, tell your worn out jokes, everybody laughs at the right point, and then you wander off to the pub. And actually, we didn't get the opportunity to wander off the pub at Embercombe, which I'm going to complain about next year if that doesn't happen. But the long and short of it was, you know, you sat down, you just talked to people, and they asked you questions, and you explained, and you could explain in great detail because you're not actually sitting there gibbering on about the normal things you gibber on about. So that was quite good fun. I'm trying to think of any other places that I described as truly inspirational. And shockingly, you know, actually, I don't think I can think of places. I can think of people. I mean, people like Roy Dennis or Tim McCrill who've reintroduced the white-tailed eagles to the Isle of Wight. I mean, there's nothing more satisfying than sitting, you know, with them in the pub after you've seen these huge birds lift off from the top of the aviaries, you know, above the undercliff where they were 180 years ago, and they're putting them back now. I think people I think are still more important than places, and there are some terribly good people who've done some amazing things that it's good to spend time with.
And just to say, I agree, and just to say that kind of from our perspective, from Embercombe's perspective, that's what we are trying to do, bring together some of these fabulous people to talk about what we should be doing, you know, so that's certainly something we want to support. And Derek, it's why you are always welcome in our building and on our land, and we hope to see more of you. Let's just see how much time we've got left. We've got about 8 minutes. Here's a good question from Sarah. What role and responsibilities do you think NGOs have at the moment? Are they doing enough? Are there any out there that are pushing for this?
The NGOs try hard. I think one of the problems we really have as a culture, and it's something that's coming up to face us fast, is that in nature conservation is not very old. The whole idea that you're going to take an area of land and you're going to preserve it for its intrinsic nature worth, or the intricacy of the plants or invertebrates or butterflies or whatever else lives there, and for no other reason, is probably barely a century in age. I mean, before that, sure, you had nature reserves or game preserves, but they were preserved so that somebody could hunt animals, and that's the way it worked. And sometimes remarkable things happened there as well, because I mean, if you look at things like the survival of the European bison, it only survived from now because people wanted to hunt it, and they maintained them in hunting parks. And if you crossed the wall of those hunting parks and killed a bison without the permission of the baron or the noble or the king that owned them, then you were dead, and that was it. So they were different things. So I think the NGOs try very hard. I think this is a very difficult time for them. I think there is grave danger when it comes to the insularity of thinking that many of them hold in common, is that you always view, be it, you know, butterfly conservation organization or any of the others, there is a mainstream kind of thinking, which is that it's slow, we have to follow science everywhere, you know, we have to be very clear in what we do, we have to be deliberate, we have to think slowly, we have to be cautious about what other people think of us. And I think it's an anchor, and it's a dangerous thing to have, because what it means is that you cannot be radical and you can't be fast. Everything you do is slow and ponderous, and this is not the time for slow and ponderous thinking. I think there are a lot of really good people trying really hard, but I think the culture needs to change, and I think the culture needs to become one. It needs to become more of a farming type culture, whereby you're told what to produce and then you bloody well do it. And that's it. And you don't spend huge amounts of money woollying around, create reports and feasibility studies and stupid models and find evidence gaps that don't exist, and then just drive yourself up a cul-de-sac and sit there waiting for the next cul-de-sac to explore. That's a bloody pointless thing. And at the end of it all, you look at some of these folk, you think, well, what's going to happen when you get to 62, get your membership of your golf club, you're sitting there with a colostomy bag on, playing dominoes in the dark with the last of your remaining mates who wants to talk to you. Do you think you really feel you've lived a life that was worthwhile? Or do you think you crossed a lot of T's and dotted a lot of I's and now it's all over and, well, that's it? Great. No.
Okay, so a question, we're getting a few questions about, so I'm aware that we've only got 5 minutes left as well, so speeding up. We're getting a few questions about, okay, so my friend's got a big land area, or we have a village green or a tarmac road. What's the first thing that needs to be done? What's the first moment of transformation then from a place?
Gosh, well, you could speak to Dr. Alistair Driver at Rewilding Britain, who's got all the time in the world on his hands because he's employed full time to get the whole of Britain rewilding, and he's a jolly useful chap. And if you speak to him, I think they're producing, oh gosh, are they producing manuals, or what do they call them nowadays? There'll be forum and platforms and manuals and all that sort of crap. And if you go and speak to them, they will give you, you know, some ideas as to what you can do. There are possibly networks you can join. I mean, I'm really sorry, but there's so many kind people who say, can you come and look at this? And, you know, I'd love to. I don't have time. I just don't have time. I think probably, you know, contacting something like Rewilding Britain, or indeed the Wildlife Trust, who are a decent bunch of chaps too, and who may very well have project officers that are able to come advise you on, you know, whether you're rich and how to manage it and so on. You're going to have to start looking out to those organisations more. But I think also that as this whole idea of nature restoration changes and accelerates, there's going to come a point when there is much more information available there for, you know, for people who want to do these sorts of things. So at this point in time, you know, just go out and hassle the people that are the big organisations who should be able to help you, and just keep on pounding on their door until they answer.
Fantastic. And also to say, you have got a wonderful farm as well in Devon, which is a total inspiration to visit, Derek. I've been there, and what the Beavers have done on your farm is absolutely amazing to look at. So I understand that it's kind of open, or will be open, kind of for rewilding visitation.
Yeah, we're hoping to do a lot more training stuff next year, and just have a lot more kind of like fun weekend. And what they'll see is, you'll hopefully see the successes, you'll see some of the problems, and you'll see some of the things that have gone really, really wrong. If people are interested, that will start from, you know, as soon as things start to dry out next year, and we'll be able to show you what happens when you put 3 water buffalo into 150 acres in Devon in the winter, whether they open ponds or whether they turn it into something that would look like the Somme after the German heavy guns have finished.
Fantastic. I think we're going to have to wind it up because we've only got 2 minutes. But just to say, Derek, keep us posted. I mean, we will keep an eye on your Keep It Wild project. When we find out more about it, we'll certainly let everybody know through our social media channels. Also to say that we have got some rewilding camps going on next year for anybody that wants to get involved in those. Derek will be part of our programmes, so we'll let you know when those are going to be. And also to say thank you so much, Derek, for joining us. It's always a pleasure. I think you should be Prime Minister, you know, but
I think you'd regret that move very fast. You think Boris is not getting it right? By the time I've forgotten what I was supposed to do yesterday, then you'd be in for some bloody big surprises. We all would.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. That's been absolutely brilliant, and we hope to see you back here at some point soon. All right, Derek, next time you come to Embercombe, we will take you to the pub, okay?
Hey, thank you very much. I'll hold you to that. Thanks, right. Rachel. Bye-bye.
Lots of love. Cheerio, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.